oriented. Yeah.
Other interesting things for images is that, everybody has cell phones and they can take movie videos. In Iran lately, in the demonstrations, people have been getting out their cell phones and there was some big posted on YouTube.
Right. Yes. So here's the. I mean, let's go look back at this complex. Can you move the projection over just a little bit so I can have more white room? Yeah, we'll move it over that way. Okay. So television, transnational satellite television like Al Jazeera, has 80% to 100% penetration. Everyone watches the news, and Al Jazeera, as you know, has different kinds of news standards. So it doesn't have the same squeamishness and issues that, say, our corporate news system has for filtering out the very ugly side of everything. So something on Al Jazeera, is going to be graphic. It's going to be often unedited, and everyone is watching it. So again, in a situation like you've had in the last 3 weeks, you've got these images that reverberate with one another because you've got the same crowd shots from Egypt, from Libya, from tiny Bahrain, where the entire population could fit inside Tahrir Square in Egypt, and yet the crowd mood and the crowd shots are similar, and you don't actually know, you get this real sense of the kind of contagious viral nature of this uprising, okay, just as you do in wars. You're not sure whether this is graphic image from Palestine, from Iraq, from Afghanistan. You just know that you hate it. And every family sort of watches this stuff. And so it's all out there, yeah.
So it leads to the question, what percentage in Syria are on Twitter, on Facebook, communicating out to the world, and what is their reaction to this? Do you see,
yeah.
see that happening in Syria?
Well, here's the interesting thing, okay? These statistics here basically have to do with, the traditional kind of access to the internet that you and I sort of use in our daily lives. Clearly, it's not necessary or sufficient to start or maintain a revolution or a mass movement. But look at it this way. People are watching TV, developing emotional reactions, and they've been developing them for the last 15 years in a passive reception kind of way, okay? The most educated and sort of prosperous people have, email accounts and sort of surf the web and do things like this. The main conduit for Twitter, at least, and maybe Facebook, is not the internet. It is cellular telephony, okay? Which again, if you think back to the kind of free market in satellite dishes that I was describing throughout the Middle East, you got something very similar going on in terms of cellular telephony, where every little street has a shop, everybody knows how to change SIM cards, and people even do things that are developing out there in the world include banking by cell phone throughout the third world, or actually converting of financial resources through cell phone bills. Through the sort of the integration and manipulation of cell phone bills, this becomes a sort of a shadow banking system. Things that we, again, in our very corporate controlled world, can't even sort of imagine, yeah.
I'm going to try to speak as loudly as possible.
Oh, sorry.
No, thank you. I have a question based on the history of family networks, social networks, communication among and between different groups in the pre-technological age, and versus the top-down sort of message from the state.
Sounds like you're thinking of something.
Well, I'm just wondering. Yeah, no, I'm just wondering, how that plays into. I mean, all of these sort of deconstructed, gateless, or gatekeeperless kind of. I mean, I don't know if I'm just making a big stretch here, or.
I don't think so.
Because from what I understand, and you can, please correct me, but, word of mouth, as opposed to getting the news from the state or from, a sort of local source, or word of mouth definitely had, an equal, if not greater, sort of role in communication in pre-technological Middle Eastern societies.
That's a very good question, and
Let's talk about it another time.
no,
Oh.
let's talk about it right now.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Here,
Because
thanks.
Sure. Because the basic story here, let's go back to cellular telephony again, because it's a nice starting point, because it is oral and it is a decentralized network, and it also, the proliferation of cell phones in the Middle East results from the incompetence of the state. So in Syria, for example, when a child is born, one of the first things that you do after you get a birth certificate is you go down to the state telephone office to put him on a waiting list so that when he's about to get married 25 years in the future, maybe he will have a landline. Okay? That, I'm not kidding. That's the third world kind of infrastructure in a place like Syria that you're talking about, where my husband, a Syrian, I've gone native. That's partly why I want to have my students do all the talking, not me. My husband was on a phone list that his father signed him on when he was a small child, before we finally got the landline, sometime around 2003. Okay, that is the equivalent of crappy state propaganda TV, crappy state infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Middle Easterners, whenever given a chance, for reasons not having to do with, say, pernicious stereotypes about their mercantile nature, but because of certain free market traditions in the Middle East, they are hustling all the time. So people are hustling for technical knowledge. They are hustling for access to resources in a good way, not in a stereotyped kind of way. So state television is a big joke because it's just a mouthpiece for your authoritarian state. When in the 1990s suddenly you have access to a dish and a cheap Korean receiver costing 1 month's wages or whatever, you are all over that. And the example of that is the only Middle Eastern country that was able to keep out satellite TV for years was, of course, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, under the helpful effect of U.S. sanctions, which basically killed the free market in Iraq, giving him an iron grip on the market as well as state infrastructure. One of the good things that happened in April of 2003 when Baghdad fell was we had a good indication of how fast, after the Saddam regime was out of there, within weeks, satellite television, which had been a pent-up demand for a decade, saturated the country, and it just flowed in like a tsunami. Everyone had a satellite dish and a receiver. The minute Saddam Hussein was gone, within something like 7 weeks, the market was saturated. People had the connections to get those Korean receivers. They knew how to program them. It was all just there. Okay, same thing with cellular telephony. If you are waiting for 30 years for a landline, in the 1990s, you're going to get a cell phone. Everyone and their grandmother has a cell phone, okay? And something like Twitter, you don't have to go and crank up your old home computer. And the way people are using this in the Middle East is you snap a picture, you tweet it immediately, and you are watching almost real-time footage of people coming into hospitals, bodies being pulled out on drawers in the morgue, someone going down in front of you, all this kind of stuff. It's really quite amazing. So again, because you have this sort of uneven development,
Which then gets picked up
Right.
and goes back into satellite.
right? Yeah, and then it's picked up and it goes back into satellite. Maybe we will see it a lot later, but it's this really interesting ecosystem and ecology of information. Now, to go back to Mark's very interesting point that he was making, some of these dynamics are a lot like the dynamics of talk or gossip or word-of-mouth communication that we think of as being sort of pre-modern or typically Middle Eastern or whatever, that if we could have studied it or we could have had access to it as anthropologists, this would be really interesting, sort of sitting on the gossip networks, sitting on the way that information spread in a Middle Eastern urban environment before any of these technologies came along. Where we're coming back to is a system that is that networked and that decentralized, but it's mediated by these by these very different kinds of technologies. So again, something spreads like that, and so you had decentralized communications of a pre-modern nature, if we can use that kind of typology. The state comes in the 20th century with all its bulky, incompetent, inefficient infrastructures, and tries to centralize and control all information. It's all about the state. And then in the 1990s, that opens up a little bit. We were expecting a revolution around 1996. All of us in the academy who were thinking about those things, like, yes, democratization is going to happen. Didn't happen, didn't happen, didn't happen, didn't happen, didn't happen. And then suddenly you reach a tipping point where, in fact, these networks have become cheap enough, fast enough, widespread enough that they can actually use people power to take on this huge asymmetry with the state. So suddenly the state's invested capital is worthless, and you've got hundreds of thousands of people doing things synchronously, and you can't, I hope, we'll watch how Libya plays out in the next few days. You cannot control all of them with a police state. Police state only works if you can pick people off one by one in isolated form. And again, aside, and we hope this is not the case, from going genocidal, which is certainly a possibility, particularly in Libya right now, bombardments from the air, you still have people power finally reaching a point of comparability with those centralized massive state resources. Yeah.
A lot's been on the news lately about Libya being so tribally based, and partly because Gaddafi made it doesn't have no other choice. Is Syria anything like that?
No, nothing like that. No, I mean, Syria is, there are parts of Syria in which, in the eastern parts of Syria where, old tribal forms of social organization are relevant to a minority of the population, particularly as you get closer to the Iraqi border. But by and large, that's not, you're talking about a radically different situation, much more like urbanized Egypt, very cosmopolitan, very urban, and with no kind, you'd say to someone, what's your tribe? And that'd be like, I'm saying to you, what's your tribe? You're like, oh, yeah.
So what do you think the percentage chances of anything happening in Syria against?
Well, that's an interesting question. And yes, Syria actually right now, I mean, and we can talk about this at greater length over, the next few weeks. If we do more of this type of thing. My prediction for Syria is that, for a variety of reasons, the authoritarian state in Syria is much more firm than some of these other ones. Okay? So, for example, you weren't at the Egypt party that Dr. Gamal had the other night. But the Egyptian community in Tucson met at the Luxor restaurant. Oh, sorry. Yes, you should. Yeah. No, he doesn't tweet either, but I would have tweeted you. If you were around more, I would have tweeted you for sure.
I actually heard through word of mouth there was going to be a party. I didn't know it was Dr. Gamal's.
It wasn't his. It was a consortium of sort of, it was, Dr. Fayez and Dr. Gamal and all these people. Yeah. So it was this very festive gathering, where everyone, there was a slideshow of the demonstrations in Egypt, and everyone booed at Mubarak and all this sort of thing. Everyone was very happy, and it was the day before Libya took off, and that you could really sense it in the room that night, because all the Egyptians, who are much more closely plugged into Libya than, say, someone who does Syria, were like, and Libya's next, go Libya tomorrow. And this was before any of the Libya stuff started. I mean, people really sort of sensed this from their own personal networks, okay? And of course, there were some Syrians there, and I was sort of sitting with the Syrians, and I would sort of go around and say, well, Aqbal andkon, which means, well, hopefully it's our turn next. And everyone would go, no. Because there was still not that sense that Syria is ready. So the response, when I would go up to Syrian and sort of clap them on the back and say, yes, and we're next, in my clumsy American way, they were like, they're moving away from you. Okay, that's a good indication that society is not quite ready, and we can talk about all the reasons why that is, because there are some very good reasons why that is the case. Yeah.